Welcome to the Every Brain Matters podcast. It's just pot. What's the problem? I'm Aubrey Adams, your host. Can marijuana cause episodes of psychosis, and can it lead to violence? Today we talk to leading advocates, Heidi Anderson Swan and Dr. Christy Brown and Jesse LeBlanc, about the Bryn Spejcher trial. Before listening to this podcast or watching this video, viewer discretion is advised. There will be descriptions of violent acts that lead to ending a life. This is part one of a series about the Bryn Spejcher trial, who became acutely psychotic after consuming cannabis and stabbed her date over 100 times. Well, today we speak to three leading advocates that educate the community about the harms of marijuana and especially cannabis-induced psychosis. What is cannabis-induced psychosis? Psychosis is a break from reality where a person may experience paranoia, delusions, or hallucinations. Hi, my name is Aubrey Adams. I'm the director of Every Brain Matters. Welcome to our podcast. It's just pot. What's the problem? Today, I'm going to introduce you to my fellow advocates that speak out on the harms of marijuana, especially cannabis-induced psychosis. And we are going to be talking about a trial that they're attending in California, where a young lady experienced an episode of cannabis-induced psychosis and ended up killing her boyfriend. So please welcome Christy Brown. Christy, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Okay, Aubrey. Thank you for having me. So my name is Dr. Christy Brown. The doctor is because I was a community college professor before I retired, and I've had experience with relatives who had cannabis-induced psychosis, which led me to become interested in finding out if this was really a real thing, which at first I couldn't believe, and then looking into different cases and joining up with some other groups that have had issues with different aspects of cannabis. And so, for example, I had a brother-in-law in the early 70s who had a psychotic break, and he attacked his mother. And they were, even at that time, thinking that he had been using marijuana, but they didn't believe it could be just marijuana. They thought that maybe it had been laced with something. And he was never able to recover from this, became schizophrenic, and he never was able to work. He was supposed to go to medical school. It just ruined his life completely. And then my own brother became a marijuana user. He began to grow it, and he sold it. He was called Malibu Neil. And I didn't have much contact with him because I had moved to the Midwest. But when I, came back and started having contact with him, I realized he had drug addiction, and he had some mental issues. And at one point, we went over to visit my father, who was dying, and he attacked my husband after he had been using some drug of some sort. So, these two things really scared me. And then my son, who I was trying to protect from drug abuse, started using marijuana, not, trying to hide it for a long time. And then it, became so severe, his addiction to marijuana, that he couldn't stop it. So I found out about it. And, basically, in summary, after heavy use, he had a psychotic episode. It lasted about 2 months, in which he, did a lot of really bizarre, strange things. And that's when I started really wanting to know more about marijuana, because I hadn't, realized it was addictive and it could really harm his academic performance. But I didn't know it could really create this insanity, because I thought reefer madness was just a myth. So, I've spent a lot of time researching, advocating, and trying to find out as much as I could. So basically, that's how I got involved in it. And this case was one which I thought we could learn a lot about this issue because of the situation, which we'll talk about later.
We're glad you're here with us, Christy. Thank you for your expertise on this issue and your personal experience that you're sharing today. Heidi Anderson Swan, welcome to this podcast too. It's just pot. What's the problem? And how did you become interested in advocating about the harms of marijuana, especially cannabis-induced psychosis?
Thank you so much for having me, Aubrey. And like Christy, I have personal experience with it. I'm the co-author of a young adult fictional story called A Night in Jail. It is the first fictional story that illustrates the mental health harms of marijuana. How did I become interested in this topic? I had cannabis-induced psychosis when I was a teenager. I didn't know what it was, and it was absolutely frightening. And I know that this was marijuana because my friend who I was getting high with did not have the same kind of reaction that I did. She was perfectly fine. However, I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who she was. It was back and forth like that. I couldn't stand it. It was like being on a roller coaster that I couldn't get off of, and I didn't want it anymore. Now, my brother, he really liked that feeling. He liked being out of touch with reality. So he used marijuana a little bit every day through most of middle school, high school, college, and graduate school. And today he has schizophrenia. The data shows that there's a percentage of us who are genetically predisposed to psychosis. Most of us have no idea that we are. And so using something like marijuana is very dangerous for people like us, because when I was using it as a teenager, that was in the late 70s. So the potency was very, very low. The potency today is like 20 times stronger than what it was when I was a kid. So I can't imagine what it would be like to be genetically sensitive to THC and take a hit off of a product that is so much stronger than what I had. I have great fear for youth today, for young adults today, like Chad, O'Melia, and like Bryn Spejcher. And they are illustrations of people that I have been trying to reach since 2017. That's the year that my brother and I published this book. A Night in Jail is a fictional story illustrated by my brother's true life. And I'm sad to say that his life, he was homeless, and he's actually homeless again now, right now as we speak. So he's sober. He's been clean off of drugs for what, 7 years now, but you don't get clean from a mental illness. I mean, if you have some mental illnesses, you get for life. And so this is why it's so important to get this information out to people so they understand we have one brain, one, and we have to do everything we can to protect it. And the drug that's most linked to mental illness is marijuana. And in fact, THC is the #1 environmental risk factor for schizophrenia. And this is vitally important. And I have been marching all over the state of California, trying to get elected leaders to pay attention, trying to get public health organizations to pay attention, trying to get the media to pay attention. And maybe they listen, but they're not sharing the word with anyone. And so this is an abject failure on all of their parts for not educating people when we legalize marijuana. And Chad, O'Melia, and Bryn Spejcher are victims of this, of the culture that we live in, of the lack of information. And so that is why I am so passionate about this trial and wanting to get the health information out about it, using this trial as a springboard to educate others so that you can protect yourselves and your family and your friends. Tell everyone that you know. And so Christy and I have advocated together in the past. And so this is just a natural extension of our advocacy work together, to be at this trial together. And I'm so grateful to have her ears and eyes, and we are able to complement each other and are able to share what we've been seeing. And I'm so glad that you all are here.
Well, and I'm so glad that you've agreed to join us on the Every Brain Matters podcast. It's just pot. What's the problem? Because what we're establishing here is that the THC in the cannabis plant is addictive and can cause episodes of psychosis. And we know that through science. And we know that even in low potency concentrations, it can cause that. But as Heidi was explaining, the legal products that are legal in the state of California and 25 other states now is more potent than ever before than the old school marijuana, which might have had 1-2% THC. Now we have products 15% THC up to 99% THC. So the psychosis that we're talking about today can come on faster and stronger. And we are about to, well, Christy and Heidi are about to describe a trial that they are attending today, and describe what happened to this young lady to make her act out in such a violent way. But let's also establish that these episodes of psychosis can be acute, right? And they can just happen for a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, sometimes up to months. But even though you can have just an episode, what Heidi was explaining here too was that it can cause permanent mental illness, meaning chronic psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, which is chronic psychosis that her brother has experienced. So my heart goes out to you, Heidi, that your brother is homeless on the streets. And we want the viewers to know that this is what is so important. Hear these ladies today, hear their experience. They've done the research, they've read the science. They're not making this up. They are passionate about this. This is life-changing and life-threatening, as we're about to hear. So let's get into the trial now. Let's describe, Christy, why don't you go first? Describe what's happening with the trial. Who are the players involved and what is happening right now? And then we'll go to Heidi after you.
Okay, so just to give some basic facts about the case, it was on the evening of May 28th in 2018 that Bryn Spejcher was visiting Chad O'Melia at the Thousand Oaks condo that he rented. And she had recently obtained her PhD and was practicing audiologist at UCLA Health. So she had a good education, a good job, very stable person. Chad O'Melia was a graduate of Chico State. He worked as an accountant and he was studying to be a CPA. So he also had a bright future. They had met at a dog park a few weeks earlier and they had started dating. Chad had a dog and Bryn had a husky named Arya that she loved very much. And those dogs were both at the condo that night. Chad was a person who used a lot of marijuana and he was interested in sharing it with people. And he gave Bryn some marijuana to smoke from a bong that he had in his living room. Just sitting there in the living room. Is called the communal bong. And she did not have any reaction to the first hits of marijuana. So he said he would do something to make the marijuana more intense. And so when she took that second hit off the bong, she became very ill and disoriented. And soon she began, really she described it as being very cloudy. She couldn't know where she was. She was very disoriented. She thought that she had died. She started stabbing Chad. And she then stabbed her dog and then she stabbed herself. And the roommate heard the commotion going on and Chad told him to call 911. He called 911 and when the deputies arrived, Bryn was stabbing herself in the neck. And they had to tase her and hit her with a baton 9 times before they could get the knife out of her hand. And by that time, Chad was already deceased from 108 stab wounds that Bryn had stabbed him in her state of psychosis. And so she was taken to Los Robles Hospital and treated for her neck injuries. And she was, described in news reports as hearing voices and delusions commanding her to kill Chad. I think the dog Arya survived the injuries. Then they tested the marijuana and the bong burned contents, and because they were thinking that this had to be something other than marijuana, as usually is thought. And it turned out that the only thing that they found was THC, marijuana, with these tests. And then, so Bryn was charged with second-degree murder, and this case was continued for 5 years. It was really dragged out with investigation and testing until about a month ago. They had testing done by the prosecution as well as the defense, and the prosecution agreed with the defense that Bryn was under condition of marijuana or cannabis-induced psychosis. So the state dropped the charge of second-degree murder down to manslaughter because the expert could not testify that she was responsible or she had any intent to do what she did. So that one of the really interesting things about the case is all the experts agreed, and there's no contention that this is not cannabis-induced psychosis. So this verifies cannabis-induced psychosis. Now, Chad O'Melia's parents were really outraged by this dropping of the charges because they want someone to be held accountable for what happened to their son. They're very upset and grieving. They have buttons with his picture on them if you go to the courthouse, and they're all sitting there, and they're very upset with the state. But the judge said, and he agreed with the dropping of the charges, that this is a tragedy, but it isn't a murder, because Bryn was in that state of psychosis. So she has pleaded not guilty, even of the involuntary manslaughter charge. And so this is, again, an important case, because if she is not found guilty, it will be kind of a, unique situation, because intoxication or voluntary intoxication is not supposed to be a reason for finding someone not guilty. So that's one of the reasons we're interested. And I was wondering, Heidi, if you have anything to add to that recitation of the facts.
I would say that, and I'm looking at my notes here, that the defense said that that the jury could not convict Bryn Spejcher of involuntary manslaughter if the jurors decide she was pressured into taking the second hit, because as Christy described, she had taken 2 hits. One was a little puff, the other one was a very, very significantly stronger preparation that was handed to her by Chad O'Melia. That she was, so whether she was pressured into that second hit, because that's the one that that had all of these negative mental health effects on her, and or Chad lied to her about what he was giving her. And so these are questions for the jury to say, this is how we can find her not guilty of involuntary manslaughter.
Wow, I can imagine that anybody listening to this for the first time might say, "Oh, this is reefer madness," or this is something that doesn't happen with marijuana. And I can't even imagine how Chad's family feels too. I'm wondering, do they believe that cannabis can cause these episodes of psychosis and lead to these violent acts, or have you gotten any information with that?
They've appeared, Chad's father appeared on News Nation, and he said he ran this by some lawyers, and they still feel that they should have kept the charge of second-degree murder because they feel that she was conscious. And I think there's a debate about what is meant legally by conscious of what she was doing. And I think when we get into more about what the experts said, we can, kind of parse that whole issue down. But they are not, they're not bending in terms of what they think, that she was responsible for that, what she did, or she should be held responsible.
If I could add, he said, because she's able to, Mr. O'Melia said, because Bryn Spejcher is able to recall some of what happens, that is proof that she was not completely out of her mind. And so we will talk more about what the experts say about that. But the overview is that is absolutely what a psychotic memory is like. Someone in psychosis, their memory will be fragmented. So they will remember some things and not remember other things. So I see his point, but that's not actually what the data shows about psychosis. Her experience supports the diagnosis of psychosis.
Yeah, that
That
can
she and there are parts that are completely she does not remember, could not remember.
so there is some level of consciousness during a psychotic break from cannabis. And
Know about consciousness, but memory is what we're discussing. Is memory the fact that she could remember some of it? Did that prove that she was conscious or aware, or as the doctors would say, have insight to be able to look at herself and say, "Oh, I'm tripping." If you say that, you have insight into your situation. But she was not. She was fully lost in what was happening to her internally, and she didn't have the ability to say, this isn't really happening. She fully thought that she was in a whole nother world, the dead world, as she calls it.
that false reality, and she felt like she was fighting something in that false world. And
Yes.
I noticed too, some people that have these episodes of cannabis-induced psychosis, and not everybody who experiences this becomes violent, but the ones that do will sometimes pick up the phone and call 911 on themselves, realizing that they just had this episode and not realize that they didn't intend to do it, but they did it because of the psychosis.
Right.
So Heidi, do you want to talk about the opening statements and the body cam footage of Bryn?
Oh, sure. Let me talk about the opening statements first. The prosecution starts, and the prosecution said that that this is a case of cannabis-induced psychosis, and their expert witness agrees with that. And everyone is different how they respond to drugs. And that includes THC, which is a psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. And this is something that we found out as the trial went on from different experts, that it's not just a matter of the dose, and it's not just a matter of the frequency, it's a matter of genetic variability. That is a wild card. Everybody has their own. And so this makes it possible for anything to happen to anyone with any drug. And marijuana can cause psychosis, as we know. And so anyway, the prosecution talked about that. She was very slow. She was very measured, and she described how Chad's former roommate Vinny had never used marijuana, and he was living with Chad. And a couple of months before the incident of the killing, when Chad was killed, Vinny was with Chad and the landlord of the condo. His name is Steve Bruckner. And so Chad and Steve Bruckner were childhood friends, and they were together and they got high together regularly. And they were getting high, and Chad had offered Vinny, his roommate, that to get high in the past, and on more than one or two occasions. And Vinny had always demurred and not gotten high. But for some reason that night, he decided, okay, well, this is going to be the time when I am going to get high. So Chad and Steve, he says, packed a bong for them. And this is the same bong that was used when Bryn had her experience with marijuana. It's a very, very tall bong. And so there's the bowl where the water boils, there's the pipe where you put in the green leaves, and then there's the mouthpiece, the tube that goes, and this was very long. In fact, it was so long that later on in the trial, Bryn Spejcher referred to his bong as a trumpet. That's how big it was. And so they were using this to get high that night, and they offered it to Vinny. And so Vinny had some marijuana, and this was his first time ever using it, and he became panicky, and his heart was racing, and he became very afraid, and he thought he was going to die. And he said, "You've got to take me to the hospital." And both Steve and Chad ignored his pleas to go to the hospital. And what they did instead was Chad brought him up to his room and he put him in front of South Park and said, "Just hang out here." And Vinny was like, "What do I have to do? Do I have to take off my clothes and run naked down the street for someone to take me seriously, to take me to the hospital?" And they were like, "Yeah, yeah, whatever." And they left him. And eventually he became less panicked and less frightened and was very hungry. And later they all went out for donuts. And then around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the next day, that was when Vinny had to go to work and he was still impaired at that time. And so people who are what they call naive users can have a much stronger effect with the THC than people who have a tolerance for it, who have built up a tolerance for it, or have a different genetic composition, like Chad and like Steve, who were not panicked, did not want to take off their clothes and run down the street to have someone take them to the hospital. But this was the reaction from his roommate, who was in psychosis. If you think you're going to die, that's psychosis. And this, to me, is one of the major themes of this trial that we have to get out into the public. If you see someone, or if you are feeling like you're going to die, or you see someone who is disconnected from reality, this is a very serious situation, and it's not one to be laughed at. It's not one to be dismissed or minimized, because if a person is convinced of something, they can act on that reality that they are in. Now, he had the friends there to keep him from running down the street naked, but what if he was by himself? What if he had just gotten high by himself? And then the only thing that made sense to him was to run down the street naked to get attention, to be taken to the hospital. He could have been killed that way. I mean, we've heard of people here in Los Angeles who were walking down the freeway and got killed. And you were like, what are they thinking? Well, if they're hallucinating, that's, something that we all need to consider. And then we have a friend, Lori Robinson, whose son Shane was in severe psychosis, and he wanted, when they were driving him to the mental hospital down the 101 freeway, he wanted to jump out of the car when it was going 60 miles an hour because he wanted to save Barack Obama. It makes no sense. But when people act on their psychosis, this is when it becomes super dangerous. Now, Chad did not know that this was dangerous, and I don't blame him, because there is no public health education telling people about paranoia and psychosis and thinking you're going to die. There is none out there. The only thing we hear about it are comedy sketches on Saturday Night Live, where they make fun of it, on South Park, where they make fun of negative health and mental health consequences with marijuana. Everybody chuckles about it. Comedians are making jokes about when they lose touch with reality on marijuana. And it makes it sound so funny and innocuous and benign, and you're just going to get past it. But that isn't what's always happened. So this is, I think, is a major theme to this. And as I've said, I blame public health organizations. I blame the industry first and foremost. They know what their products can do to some people, and they should be warning about it. They are not. I blame our government for not warning and taking care of its citizens. And I blame also public health organizations like the California Department of Public Health. They have an Instagram campaign out there called Mind Over Marijuana. They don't say anything about psychosis and schizophrenia. We're paying for this, aren't we, as California taxpayers paying for it? And they're not mentioning it at all. I blame the National Alliance of Mental Illness. I was supposed to be speaking for them last summer at their statewide conference, and I was going to be talking about drug-induced psychosis, not just marijuana, but the other ones that can cause psychosis, like meth, like hallucinogens, like shrooms. So I was going to cover a bunch of them and talk about what we need to know. And they pulled me from their lineup because I was going to talk about marijuana, because they said it's too touchy of a subject. So they are at fault, because they knew in 2018 that marijuana can cause mental illness and worsen mental illness. And they have not said anything here in California. So all of these players are at fault. And so when the marijuana industry is controlling the narrative with this is good for mental health, our vets need it for PTSD, it's good for anxiety and depression and all of these things, when the long-term studies show that it's bad for depression and anxiety, increases the risk to suicide and psychosis and schizophrenia, and they're not saying anything about it. When we let them control the narrative, tragedies like this happen. So Chad saw this happen with his roommate before he had the experience with Bryn, only weeks before. And so this he did not recognize. And how would he have known? Where was the public health campaign to tell him? There was none. But the prosecution says Bryn Spejcher should have known that THC could do this to her. She willingly took a hit off the bong of marijuana, and then she said she wasn't feeling anything, so Chad gave her a second hit. But the second hit was milked. It was strengthened. He wanted to make sure she really felt something, so he made it as strong as he possibly could. How was she to know? How was she to know that this would cause any kind of psychotic reaction in her, any kind of bad reaction? Because everything everybody says about it is that it'll relax you, it will chill you out. It's, nobody is coming clean about these effects. So, but the prosecution said she should have known. And so I say, I've been out talking since 2017, a year before this happened. Nobody would listen to me. Nobody listens to me. There was no education out there. I can tell you firsthand, there was no way she could have known, because I was trying to get people to talk about it. I'm not a public health organization. They were purposely silent about it, as is our legislature and the cannabis industry. And so how could she have known? And this is what the prosecution is founded on, that she knew what she was doing. How could she have known?
I wonder if the prosecution understands that Bryn literally experienced a chemical assault to the brain, and that chemical was THC. Okay.
She said, Ms. Knopfinger said that THC turned Bryn into a monster, and that monster stabbed Chad O'Melia to death. But she chose to imbibe. And she said, just like with a DUI, you don't get to blame other people for your bad behavior. But to that, I say, there's huge, huge campaigns about the dangers of drunk driving. Friends don't let friends drive drunk, driving drunk is a deadly disease, other things but where is the public health campaign about the mental health risks of marijuana? How can she compare it to a DUI? That's a false equivalency, 100%. So there was no public health. There is no public health campaign. There aren't even warning labels. And this is something that Christy and I have been working on here. There was a bill pulled in our legislature just last year, because we were to put mental health warnings on these products so that things like this, what happened to Chad, what happened to Bryn, wouldn't happen to other people. And yet our legislature was pressured to pull this bill. They were pressured by the industry. And so, I mean, to me, the prosecution's case can't stand on anything, because there has been no education at all, none whatsoever. It's not like a DUI at all. And so, and then in the defense, I will say that the defense also was measured just like the prosecution. And during the defense's opening statements, he had up a picture of Bryn when with cheek to cheek with her dog Aria. And it was just, this vibrant, healthy, happy picture of the two of them. And that stayed up while he was talking about her. And then they showed, they talked about her and about her past, about how she's a professional, she's an audiologist, she wants to help other people with their hearing impairment. She is hearing impaired herself and had struggles in her life because of that, due to that. And so she is just this kind, athletic, with and had friends, and just and loved her dog, loved her family, and was new out in Los Angeles. And so he really painted the picture of this really intelligent and accomplished young woman who had no idea what marijuana could do. And so when a guy she was dating, and so I will correct you, Aubrey, it wasn't her boyfriend at the time, although they were involved and romantically so, they weren't technically officially boyfriend girlfriend. It was, they had only been dating a matter of weeks at this time, like less than a month. So he described her as a healthy young woman who had no mental health history, and that testimony going forward from both the prosecution and the defense would prove that she did not have any kind of mental health issues in her past at all. And so then they showed the body cam footage from the sheriffs who were called, because what happened the night of the killing is that Vinny, the roommate who previously had gotten high and had the panic attack and thought he was dying and was put up in front of South Park, he was upstairs and he had taken a shower and he was sitting on his bed scrolling through his phone, and then he heard screaming. And so, and at first he thought it was just, they were horsing around. And so he's like, oh, whatever. But he knew Bryn was there. And so, and he knew Bryn was there, and she was someone who was familiar inside the condo with him. And there was 3 young men living there. And so Vinny was there, and he knew Bryn casually, not well, but just, enough from chatting with her casually. And so, and he had seen them earlier when he came in from work and acknowledged them and went upstairs and went to take a shower. So he heard a voice say, "Get off me," and he assumed he thinks it was Bryn's voice, but he thought they were just messing around. And so after scrolling a little more on his phone, he heard again then things being thrown around and screaming. And then he was like, well, I know I better check this out, make sure everybody's okay. So he quickly put some things on, and he went down the stairs, and then he saw the couch turned over, and Bryn's holding a knife, and Chad was on the floor, and he had a big wound where his heart was. And Chad looked at Vinny and he said, "Vinny, help me. She stabbed me." And these turned out to be his dying words. And so Vinny ran up the stairs. He didn't have his phone, and so he banged on his roommate's door, and I don't think he got a response. And then he went and he grabbed his phone, and then he decided I think he said, and forgive me, when he saw Bryn, he said, before he ran back upstairs, he said, "Bryn, oh my God, what the F are you doing?" I think he said, "Stop, what the F are you doing?" Something to that effect. And then he went back, he got his phone, and then he was down the stairs, and he felt like if he didn't flee the apartment, he was going to be next in terms of victims. And so he fled the apartment, and when he left, he knew that Bryn was stabbing Chad as he was leaving. It's just heartbreaking. So he gets outside and he calls 911, and he tells them that what's happening inside. And so the deputies are dispatched, and they have on a body cam which they had in their department for about a year at this time. So it was still relatively new. Something for them to have. And so he pointed them in the direction. And then when they got to the apartments, they didn't know which way to go, but then they heard screaming. And then there was no question which way to go. So they went right to a door and they busted it down. And we see this body cam footage, and they go inside, and Bryn Spejcher is stabbing herself with a bread knife. Now, if you can imagine a long serrated bread knife, and she's stabbing herself. And so they tased her 2-3 times, but she didn't respond. She didn't react. It was like she didn't even know that they were there. She just kept stabbing herself. And so as Christy said, then this one sheriff, he took out his baton, and he'd been a peace officer for I can't remember, a long time, 20 years. And this was the first time in his career he said that he had used this baton that has an extension on it. It goes out longer. And so he reached out to hit her with it and hit her. And as she was hitting her with it, she then went on to use two hands to use the bread knife to stab herself. And I have to say, I'll go back and say that the prosecution mentioned, she said, had the deputies not come in and knocked the knife out of her hand and then stopped the bleeding once they got it out of her hand, she would have died. This would have been a suicide, a murder suicide. So the body cam footage shows that. It shows it was absolutely horrific. But she was the screaming. It was guttural. It was horrifying. And from my point of view, I couldn't see all that well, but what I could see was just horrible. You could see her movements, her legs kicking, her screaming, and
so what was going on in the court during this time when they were showing it? Bryn's mother and Bryn herself were crying and sobbing. And they had to recess the court for a short time, you told me. But then again, when they showed more body camera footage, when I had arrived in the court, they were also very distraught. So it was really hard to watch. And it was much harder for them to watch what was, what had gone on during that time. It was really heartbreaking to see the whole thing, because she was still in the throes of the psychosis, and the camera captured that.
Yes. And the camera captures her. And I didn't actually pick this up myself, but the psychiatrists later say that it captured her responding to commands inside her head. Not responding to the peace officers, but commanding to what she was hearing inside her head.
The psychiatrist said, or the psychologist said, she was impervious to pain. She just, wasn't feeling any pain because she was just inside of her head at the time.
And that's also consistent with psychosis, this imperviousness to pain. And so it was such. So after we had heard all about what a kind person and a professional and accomplished young woman she was, there she was sitting right underneath the video, which was huge on the wall right above her. And to see her screaming and acting out like a monster, as the prosecution said, and then to see her in court, and to see that she was crying. But I heard another sound, and I'm like, what is that sound that I'm hearing? It doesn't seem to be coming from the video. And then I looked in front of me, and it was a young man sobbing, who I later found out was one of Bryn's brothers. And so he was bent over and sobbing, with his head in his hands, on his knees, and so was she was sobbing. And then she ended up turning around and putting her head down towards him, and so they were both like bent over with their heads in towards each other, sobbing together, and court had to stop at that time. And they did. And then it was later again that then the mother was also sobbing. And this is just something that I witnessed during the proceedings all week long, is the great distress of the Spejcher family, and the way that they would, it kind of switched who would be having the breakdown, and the others would comfort. She had 3 brothers there, and both of her parents, and so the only one I think I didn't see breakdown was the father, but pretty much everybody else was sobbing at some point, and then the other family members were comforting them. And during the body cam footage, Chad O'Melia's father left the room, left the courthouse, and I don't blame him. Who wants to see that I don't blame him at all, but I should say that he did leave. And so, anyway, it was just really a heartbreaking thing to see, but it is so helpful to the trial because it is, unless you see it, unless you hear it, you don't quite understand the depths of where she was that night in her head and how bad this was. And otherwise, you know, it would just be the testimony of the sheriffs. It would just be the testimony of Vinny, and how would, you know, but to see it is a quite different experience. See it and hear it is quite a different experience.
I would think not only both families involved with this case, but the law enforcement that were there, the trauma
Yes.
that they endured. And it's
Yes.
just a fact of what our country is doing to the mental health of everybody involved. This isn't a spectator sport. This isn't something you can sit on the sidelines with. This really affects so many people around. The effects of marijuana are broad, and I can just add to the conversation. You know, while you both were describing this, we had 2 people in Colorado stab themselves during a cannabis-induced psychosis. It brought that up for me, and it brought up the reminder for me that what I witnessed, my loved one in psychosis changed them forever, and it changed me forever. And this is why we do what we do, because we want to prevent this from happening to other families, and we want an informed public to make good decisions. So thank you for having the courage and the strength to be here today and share this just awful situation that happened with the death of Chad. And our hearts at Every Brain Matters go out to these families, and we hope that if you are listening to this today, that you share, that you like, share, comment on this video to help us raise awareness, because this is real. Cannabis-induced psychosis is real. Not everybody becomes violent, but some do, and the ones that do are committing horrific crimes, and not just with knives, but some with guns. And we need to get this information out there. So I want to thank you all again for being here.
But Every Brain Matters is a small nonprofit, and small but mighty nonprofit, and it funded, paid for my expenses to be there, because I could not have attended court every day unless I was staying in a hotel close by. It just would not have been possible. I live too far, but close enough to drive there. And so thank you to Every Brain Matters for doing so. And if anyone wants to donate to Every Brain Matters, this is a good opportunity. This is the kind of work we do. And one of the reasons that we're doing this is that, and I don't think I mentioned this when I was calling out those who are responsible for this tragedy, is the vast majority of the media withholds these kind of stories, will not report on these stories. And so Christy and I are there to bear witness to this trial so that we can document what was said and put it out there. There is one guy there from the VC Star who is doing a very good job reporting, but that's it. That's it. I mean, and we do have the Daily Mail that is also reporting on this, and they're doing a bang up job. That's great. But where is the LA Times? Where is the Sacramento Bee? Where is the San Francisco Chronicle? Where is USA Today? I mean, there's just so many publications that should be out here. This has ramifications across our state and our country, and we have reached out. We have reached out, and they are silent. And this is part of why Chad didn't know about the harms and Bryn didn't know about the harms, because the media is silent and they don't want to be attacked for reporting on reefer madness or something. That's the only thing I can surmise. So we are reporting on it.
And thank God you are. And we are happy to support this effort. Let's turn to Jesse LeBlanc. He's become an expert on the effects of THC. Jesse, what do you have to add to this? Is this reefer madness? Or what can you share with us? Are there stories like this in the past?
You know what? Let me just read this real quick. So
Okay.
this is in Dr. Nahas's book. He died recently. This is written in I think the mid 80s. So this is from Dr. Chopra, 1971 report on psychotic episodes from cannabis users. So this is in India. So MD, age 25, a rickshaw puller. He had a history of frequent indulgence in large doses of bang and charas, which is different concoctions for cannabis. After an excessive amount of charas, he threw his sister's child from the roof of his house, injuring her seriously. Noisy, restless, filthy, incoherent, he had no idea what he had just done. He recovered after 2 months and remained normal for 1 year, when he again obtained some charas. Within a few hours after smoking the drug, he displayed the previous symptoms. He again recovered within 4 months. There was no previous history of psychosis. And remember, back then, I mean, I don't think they had PCP and all kind of other things that they could say spiked the drug. But anyway, there's case after case. You know, even Dr. Moreau from the mid 1800s, he was a psychologist. He experimented with hashish. He was conscious of what was going on, but it really scared him, because one time I remember, Heidi, we had talked about that. A window was open. He was scared what he might do, I guess, inferring that he would jump out. But he was conscious of it all because he took notes, because he was using. Back then, they would use these drugs. He was a psychiatrist. He was trying to understand mental illness. And he said this drug is the closest thing he could come to that would induce, quote unquote, temporary mental illness.
Marijuana is not a safe drug, and we will continue to raise awareness about cannabis-induced psychosis and the other harmful effects of using marijuana. This is part 1 of a series. Stay tuned for part 2. Thank you for joining us today on the Every Brain Matters podcast. It's just pot. What's the problem? Every Brain Matters is a community developed by families that have been severely impacted by the effects of marijuana, especially cannabis-induced psychosis, and how it can lead to violence. Visit us at everybrainmatters.org.